In December 1937, the city of Nanjing became the site of one of the most notorious wartime atrocities of the 20th century. At the time, Nanjing was the capital of the Republic of China, a symbol of political authority and national survival during a brutal conflict with Imperial Japan. After Japanese forces captured the city, soldiers carried out mass killings, widespread rape, looting, arson, torture, and executions of prisoners of war and civilians. The event is widely known as the Nanjing Massacre, or the Rape of Nanking. It was not a single incident in one location, but a wave of violence that unfolded across the city and surrounding areas after the Battle of Nanjing. To understand how this happened, we need to look at the war already underway, the collapse of the city's defenses, the decisions made by Japanese commanders, and the experiences of civilians trapped inside. The massacre took place during the Second Sino-Japanese War, which began in full scale in July 1937 after years of Japanese expansion into China. By late 1937, Japanese forces had already fought a devastating battle for Shanghai. That battle lasted months and caused enormous casualties on both sides, but in November, Shanghai fell. The road to Nanjing was then open. As Japanese troops advanced inland along the lower Yangtze River, the campaign was marked by extreme violence. Civilians in towns and villages along the route were killed, communities were destroyed, and Japanese soldiers carried out terror tactics meant to break resistance. Nanjing was not an isolated eruption of brutality. It was the most infamous point in a broader pattern of atrocities that had accompanied the Japanese advance after Shanghai. By early December, the Japanese Central China Area Army had reached the outskirts of Nanjing under the command of General Iwane Matsui. The Chinese National Revolutionary Army had suffered heavily in earlier fighting and was struggling to defend the capital. The Chinese government had already begun relocating, and many officials, soldiers, and civilians were fleeing. Yet hundreds of thousands of people remained inside or near the city, including refugees who believed Nanjing's walls might offer some protection. Japanese planning reflected the expectation of severe fighting. According to historical accounts, Japanese forces had considered using mustard gas and incendiary bombs if resistance became too strong. The city was therefore caught between military collapse and the threat of overwhelming force, with civilians having little ability to escape the disaster approaching them. Leadership decisions mattered. Prince Yasuhiko Asaka, a member of the Japanese imperial family, was installed as a temporary commander during the campaign. Before the city's capture, an order was issued to kill captives. The exact chain of responsibility has been debated by historians, but the effect was catastrophic. Chinese prisoners of war and suspected soldiers were treated as people to be eliminated rather than protected under the laws of war. General Matsui and Prince Asaka did not stop the violence once it began. Military discipline collapsed or was deliberately ignored, and Japanese units entered Nanjing with an atmosphere of permission to kill. In wars, atrocities are often made possible not only by hatred or chaos on the ground, but by commands, failures of command, and the refusal of leaders to restrain their forces. On December 13, 1937, after days of intense fighting, Japanese troops entered Nanjing. The city's defenses had broken, and many Chinese soldiers discarded uniforms to avoid capture, blending into the civilian population. Japanese troops responded by rounding up large numbers of men, often accusing them of being soldiers based on little more than age, appearance, or suspicion. Thousands of captured Chinese soldiers were summarily executed, a direct violation of the laws of war. Many male civilians were killed in the same sweeps. Executions took place in groups, sometimes near riverbanks, roads, fields, or city gates. The victims were often tied together or marched away under guard. In many cases, there was no investigation, no trial, and no distinction between combatant and civilian. The conquest of the city quickly became a campaign of mass murder. The violence was not limited to military-age men. Japanese soldiers murdered civilians across the city, including children, women, and the elderly. Homes were entered and looted. People hiding in houses, temples, schools, and refugee camps could be dragged out, beaten, or killed. Arson destroyed large parts of Nanjing, with roughly 1/3 of the city burned. The destruction had practical and symbolic consequences. It robbed survivors of shelter, erased neighborhoods, and deepened the terror spreading through the population. Reports from the time describe a city where normal life disappeared almost overnight. Streets became dangerous, families were separated, and survival often depended on hiding, luck, or reaching areas protected by foreign residents. For civilians, the fall of Nanjing did not mean the end of battle. It meant the beginning of a new and unpredictable danger. One of the defining horrors of the massacre was widespread sexual violence. Japanese soldiers raped women and girls on a massive scale, with victims ranging from children to the elderly. Many were assaulted in homes, refugee shelters, schools, and public spaces. Some victims were murdered afterward, either to hide the crime or as part of the same pattern of violence. Estimates of the number of rapes vary widely, from several thousand to tens of thousands, with figures around 20,000 often cited by historians. The exact number can never be known, partly because many victims were killed, and partly because survivors often faced stigma and silence. But the evidence from eyewitness accounts, diaries, tribunal records, and survivor testimony shows that sexual violence was systematic, widespread, and central to the terror experienced in Nanjing. Amid the collapse, a group of Western residents created the Nanjing Safety Zone, an area intended to shelter civilians from the worst of the violence. The international committee included missionaries, doctors, businesspeople, and other foreign residents. One of its best-known members was John Rabe, a German businessman and member of the Nazi Party who nevertheless used his status to pressure Japanese troops and protect Chinese civilians. The safety zone was not fully safe. Japanese soldiers entered it, committed crimes, and removed people from it. But compared with the rest of the city, it offered vital refuge. Historians credit the safety zone with saving at least 200,000 lives. The committee members documented atrocities in letters, diaries, and reports, creating some of the most important evidence later used to reconstruct what happened. How many people were killed in the Nanjing Massacre remains one of the most debated questions in the history of the event. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East estimated that more than 200,000 people were killed. Many scholars accept this as a credible figure, while newer estimates often place the death toll between 100,000 and 200,000. Other estimates range lower or higher depending on definitions, whether counting only the city itself, the immediate suburbs, or the broader Shanghai to Nanjing campaign region. Some figures have been as low as 40,000 for narrower geographic definitions, while others exceed 300,000 when the larger region is included. These differences do not erase the reality of the massacre. They show how scale, geography, missing records, destroyed bodies, and political disputes affect historical counting after mass violence. The traditional account describes the massacre as lasting roughly 6 weeks from December 13, 1937, into late January 1938, centered on Nanjing and its immediate surroundings. That timeline is useful, but it can also be too narrow. Atrocities by Japanese forces in the region did not simply stop after 6 weeks. Violence persisted in the Nanjing area into March 1938, and similar crimes had already occurred during the advance from Shanghai. This broader context matters because it challenges the idea that Nanjing was only a breakdown of discipline after one battle. Instead, many historians see it as part of a larger pattern of occupation violence, anti-civilian terror, and the deliberate mistreatment of prisoners of war. Nanjing stands out because of its scale, documentation, and symbolic significance, but it was connected to a wider war of brutality. After Japan's defeat in World War II, the Nanjing Massacre became part of the post-war war crimes process. General Iwane Matsui and several other commanders connected to the Nanjing campaign were found guilty of war crimes and executed. The trials recognized that commanders could be held responsible not only for giving unlawful orders, but also for failing to prevent or punish crimes committed by troops under their authority. However, not everyone connected to the campaign faced trial. Some Japanese military leaders had died or committed suicide before the tribunals. Prince Asaka was granted immunity as a member of the imperial family and was never tried. For many survivors and later historians, these gaps contributed to a sense that justice was partial and that full accountability for Nanjing was never achieved. The Nanjing Massacre remains a deeply sensitive issue in relations between China and Japan. In China, it is remembered as a national trauma and a symbol of wartime suffering under Japanese aggression. Museums, memorials, survivor testimonies, and public ceremonies preserve the memory of the dead and the experiences of those who lived through it. In Japan, many historians and citizens acknowledge the massacre, but nationalist and revisionist voices have repeatedly minimized, questioned, or denied its scale. Some political figures have visited controversial memorial sites or made statements that inflame tensions. The dispute is not only about numbers, it is about responsibility, memory, education, and the moral meaning of the past. The historical evidence shows that mass killing, rape, looting, and destruction occurred in Nanjing on a vast scale. Remembering that truth matters because atrocities are not only events of the past. They are warnings about what can happen when war, racism, militarism, and impunity are allowed to converge. If you found this helpful, please like this video and subscribe for more explainers.